In my first years in the city schools in Columbus, Georgia, my favorite teacher and the one I best remember was Evelina Taylor, who first taught me to believe in myself. She took my face between her two hands and looking at me straight in the eye said, "I believe in you." It meant something for her to tell me that she believed in me, that the color of my skin was not supposed to be a barrier to my aspirations, what education is and what it was supposed to do for me. These were lonely years for me. These were the years after the death of my mother, a beautiful woman, a washerwoman who had been saving 50 cents a week for my education, hoping that eventually she would be able to send her oldest son to college. Her hopes did not materialize. She died long before I was 10. I did, however, go to school earlier than some of the other children. We lived just outside the city limits. Children living beyond the city limits were supposed to go to county schools because the city schools charged county residents $3.75 each semester for the use of books. This was a monumental sum of money for us because my father made from $10 to $14 a week as a combination farmer and fire tender at the brickyards. In order to get $3.75 required each semester, my father made a contribution and my various uncles made contributions. It was a collective thing to raise what was for us a large sum of money, not only to send a child to a city school instead of a county school, but also to make certain that the one child in the family attending the school had slightly better clothing than the other children. So I had a coat that was fairly warm and a pair of shoes that was supposed to be warm, but really was not. As I think about the shoes, my feet sometimes get cold, even now. But I did not tell my benefactors that the shoes were not keeping me warm. That's a lot different from kids now, ain't it, man? Wow, man. Whew. Made me want to cry just reading this story. Y'all forgive me. I grew up in a religious environment after we came to Columbus, Georgia. And after the passing of my mother, the local church became my community center and a place where most of the community activities occurred. It was here that I wondered about my place in history and why I could not find any of my people in any of the books that I read. And my concern began to change to irritation. Where were we in history? Did we just spring up as a people from nothing? What were our old roots? As I approached the end of my last year in grammar school, Evelina Taylor told me that she would not let me use the color of my skin as an excuse for not preparing lessons or an excuse for not aspiring to be true to myself and my greatest potential. She taught me that I must always prepare. I think my value to the whole field of teaching history is that I have prepared during my lifetime, and I have prepared in the years when no one was thinking anything about black studies. But I kept on preparing until ultimately the door opened. I had to search, however, for some definitions of myself. And during that last year in grammar school, I began to receive some of the privileges in the school that generally went to the light-complected youngsters whom we call the Light Brigade. They were the sons and daughters of the professional blacks, the doctors and the teachers who were usually of light complexion. I was the leader of the group called the Dark Brigade, the poorest of the children who came from the other side of the railroad tracks. I received that privilege in the school not just as the leader of the contingent of young people who came from my neighborhood, but because for once the teachers could nominate the best student to ring the bell. Mrs. Taylor, who played no favorites, nominated me. This privilege gave me my first sense of power. The feeling that I could stand in a window and ring a bell and 500 children would march out. Or I could ring it earlier or later, but they were simply immobile until I rang that bell. After handling my responsibility a little recklessly for a few days by ringing the bell a little early or a little late just to prove my prerogative to do it, I realized that I was not living up to my best potential as Miss Taylor meant it. So he was abusing his power a little bit. It was the bell. Then I began to exercise this responsibility in the exact manner in which it was supposed to be exercised. To ring the bell for the first recess at exactly 10:15 a.m. To ring the bell for the second recess at noon. To ring for the return of the children into the school at exactly 12:45 p.m. And to ring for dismissal at exactly 3 p.m. Thereby, I learned something about the proper use of authority and responsibility. I wanted to advance the status of my particular little group, the poorest students in the school. They were not the poorest in the way they learned their lessons, because they could readily compete with students who came from homes where they had books and some degrees of comfort, and who wore shoes even in the summertime, which was unthinkable to us because generally we had one pair of shoes and that pair had to last the entire year. I wanted, however, to do something to make my group look exceptionally good. I had been the leader of the current events forum in my school, and because I worked before and after school, mostly for white people who had good libraries and children who never read the books, I began to borrow books from their libraries and bring them home. In Columbus, Georgia, where they had Jim Crow libraries and black people could not use the public library, I began to forge the names of well-known white people on notes that instructed the librarian to give me a certain book. I accumulated a great many books that way. This illegitimate book borrowing went on for quite some time until one day, the white person whose name I had forged appeared in the library at the same time I did. That put an end to my illegitimate use of the public library of Columbus. One Friday evening, when the teachers let us do whatever we wanted to do, I planned to do something extraordinary in the leadership of the current events forum. My group had always done a few exceptional things because I would take the magazines and newspapers from the homes of whites, and rather than throw them into the garbage can, I would distribute them among our group. I also brought copies of the World Almanac once a year. Oh, wow. I'm sorry, we won't even read a Dr. Seuss. You know, I mean, these people fought, man, just to read. My group, therefore, always had news from Atlanta. News about the Japanese Navy and news about many different things. When they spoke in school about current events, they were able to speak with authority about international news because they had authoritative sources. I have always had a phenomenal memory. When I was a youngster, I could quote verbatim much of what I had read in almanacs and in small encyclopedias. In trying to literally outdo the Light Brigade, I decided to prepare something on the role of the black man in ancient history. I went to a lawyer for whom I worked. He was a kind man whose library I had used quite extensively. I asked him for a book on the role that black people had played in ancient history. Then he paid me the highest compliment that a white man could pay a black man in the period when I was growing up. He told me that one day I might grow up to be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. At that time, white people considered that the greatest achievement to which a black man could aspire was to reach the status of the great educator, Booker T. Washington. Now they say you can be like Michael Jordan.